Hey guys, how would you like to hang out with me, my friends from Ward Radio, The Stick of Joseph, Greg Mattson, and a bunch of other podcasters on the Wavemakers Cruise to Mexico this November 15th through the 22nd? We're going to be doing live events, meet and greets, and all of this while having a blast in Mexico. The details are on goanddotravel.com and use code ThoughtfulFaith for a discounted rate. Jordan Peterson is one of my heroes. I think he, more than anyone else, is responsible for the death of the new atheist movement. But for a while, I have been feeling like the Jordan Peterson phenomena was beginning to fade. And with his recent appearance on Jubilee, it only confirmed what I had suspected. The Jordan Peterson era has passed. Now, please don't take this the wrong way. Jordan Peterson is and continues to be a brilliant man with a powerful message. In fact, I would say that no one in my lifetime has more compellingly showed the dangerous bankruptcy of a secular worldview than Jordan Peterson. He has changed millions of lives for the better by showing how secularization of individuals and societies leads to chaos and evil. But I think my friend Trent Horn summed things up well.
I think Jordan Peterson is popular with and extremely frustrating for Christians for this reason. Peterson is very good at explaining the bad news of the secular life, but he is not able to explain the good news of Christianity.
Exactly. You see, Jordan Peterson is a critic. He's a critic or polemicist of secularism. He is very good at deconstructing the worldview of people who love to deconstruct religion. But deconstruction is easy. Building and then defending a fully fleshed out, coherent worldview that actually works on both the individual and societal level is very difficult. During the past 20 years, in the popular conversation, New Atheism rose up and offered a powerful critique of religion. But then, as the fruits of this secularization began pushing our society into confusion and chaos over everything under the sun, including gender, people like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay began pointing out that our abandonment of God was really what was fueling this insanity. So while Jordan may have helped people reject secularism and point them in the direction of Christianity, it should be remembered that Jordan is not a confessional Christian. Jordan is actually in the space that many people find themselves. Many now realize that the secular worldview is problematic and unsustainable in a million ways. But what's the alternative? Christianity? Jordan would probably say yes, but that only leads you into the realm of defining what Christianity is. Because for Christianity to be meaningful and impactful, it has to be specified and then even defended. You see, Jordan made a major mistake recently when he went on Jubilee to defend Christianity. Because now, instead of playing the critic, Jordan would be defending Christianity. He'd be playing the role of the apologist without even being a confessional Christian.
You're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
Don't be a smartass.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing. Right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
And while the snarky little atheists had their fun, I think my friend Alex O'Connor gave a more thoughtful critique. You see, I don't think Jordan Peterson is really well versed in the major problems that atheists rightly point out in the creedal Christian tradition. Many people find themselves stuck right now between the soul-destroying atheism and the incoherent mess of creedal Christianity. Jordan does an excellent job of pointing out the problems with the secular worldview, but Alex does a great job of pointing out the flaws in the creedal tradition. For example, let's start with the absurd creedal notion of biblical infallibility and see the problems this creates for Jordan.
So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery is wrong, I think
No,
it
it
should
says
say
that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
So this seems completely confused to me. It is, of course, true that the Hebrew Bible not only mentions or describes slavery, but proactively condones it and does indeed give you instructions on exactly how to own and sell other human beings as private property. Take a look at Exodus 21. That's that same Exodus which recounts the story of God liberating the Israelites from Egypt. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. So the kind of slavery that we're talking about here for Hebrews is more like a kind of indentured servitude. You only keep them for a set amount of time, after which they get to go free. Unless, of course, it's a girl. If a man sells his daughter into slavery, she doesn't go free like the male slaves do. She's a slave for life. Oh, and I'm reading here from the updated NRSV translation. The NIV translates the Hebrew word ebed as servant here rather than slave. But take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, where that same word, ebed, is used. Remember that you were slaves, ebed, in Egypt. So whatever kind of slavery or servitude we're talking about here in Exodus, it's the same word the Bible uses to describe the Israelites under Egyptian bondage. Oh, and for that male servant who gets to go free after 6 years, if the master gives him a wife and he has children, then when he goes free, the wife and the children stay with the master. But if the man decides that he loves his wife and his children and his master and decides to stay with them, what do you think happens? Do you think they all get to go free together? No, you take the male to the doorpost, you pierce his ear like cattle, and he becomes your servant for life. Later in that same chapter, we read, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Remember, this is from the book of Exodus, the book which Jordan Peterson thinks tells us that slavery is definitely wrong and immoral.
Here is the reality. The Bible contains contradictions, and atheists like Alex love to point those out because creedal Christians assume biblical infallibility. But what Alex does not account for is that the verses like these are an anomaly that contradict the theme of the biblical corpus, which central theme is that we are all made in the image of God and so loved and so valued that no matter what our circumstances, Christ was willing to die for us. And Alex does not realize that the very reason he opposes slavery at all is because he was raised in a Western culture, deeply influenced by the themes of the Bible rather than specific passages that contradict those themes. Now, all of this is much more easily resolved from a Latter-day Saint paradigm because we hold to biblical reliability rather than the God-breathed word-for-word biblical infallibility.
So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
Okay, we're back to slavery, and this time with genocide as well. My favorite subject in the context of the Hebrew Bible is what I mean by that.
Is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
Do you see how Jordan is forced to take a sort of Latter-day Saint position? You can't hold that an unchanging God is commanding genocide and endorsing slavery, and then say it's the same God who endows all mankind with inherent equality and dignity. It is only by rejecting biblical inerrancy that you have a way of dealing with this issue. Just look at how Alex roasts even brilliant Christians when they force themselves into believing every word in the Bible is directly from God himself.
God commands the slaughter of innocent children. Children we know are innocent, non-combatants, non-combatant women as well, not to mention animals for some reason too. And the question is, why would God command such acts of seeming genocide? This was actually one of my prompts when I was doing the surrounded thing for Jubilee. I said that God commands genocide in the Old Testament. And Christian responses to this vary because, the text is there, it's quite clear. But some Christians say it's an exaggeration. They say that God didn't really want the Israelites to wipe everyone out. He was just using exaggerated war rhetoric. Others might just be more liberal about scripture. They say these things just didn't happen or were misreported. But some just say, yeah, God commanded the slaughter of children and he had every right to because, he's God, so why not? That's the line that, for instance, William Lane Craig took when I interviewed him about this problem. And look, if you want to see somebody just own an unfathomably unintuitive moral conclusion, grab some popcorn and stick that episode on.
It was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
Ugh.
You must understand how that sounds. But let's see what response Dr. Peterson chooses.
Well, the biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text. There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text. And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But that's a mistake, I think. It's an analytic mistake because you're putting the cart before the horse.
Now, Peterson made a great point here. The guy across from him likely has never questioned why he opposes genocide in the first place. Would Romans or Aztecs or Mongols or Vikings have had any problem with these verses? No.
Okay, so I do agree that it's really important to contextualize, particularly biblical stories. But before we do that, I always like to ask somebody, okay, what is the kind of context you think could exist that would justify God commanding the slaughter of innocent children and non-combatant women and non-combatant men, like the disabled, as well as the animals that also live in that area? Like, what kind of context do you think could justify that? We're told that these Canaanite tribes are deeply immoral and have been in their sin for hundreds of years, but we also know that the children are slaughtered. Unless you just want to say that, well, the children deserved it too, which maybe you think. A lot of Christians think that people are just born in sin. But why do the Canaanites deserve that more than any other tribe? Like when you're talking about that individual child, they've committed no more or less sin than an Israelite child of the same age, if we're talking about like infants. And yet when the Israelites are sinful, God sends them a messenger with literal stone tablets guiding them to the truth and giving them a promised land. When the Canaanites sin, they don't get that same moral guidance. They get the Israelites coming in and slaughtering the men, women, children, and animals. It just doesn't seem that fair intuitively. So again, I understand that we need to contextualize these stories, but what kind of context do you think provides a moral justification for commanding the slaughter of non-combatant children?
How about God didn't command it? Because maybe the Bible, while inspired, also contains the fingerprints of the people who compiled it. And if you think that makes the Bible unreliable, just think about this. If you have a book written by the 12 greatest brain surgeons in the world, is it only reliable if the authors are completely infallible? The reality is that the very moral intuitions that these atheists have emerged because they were raised in a Western society where there were Western values which demonstrably emerged historically from the influence of the biblical library as a whole, despite passages which run contrary to those biblical themes. But the idea that the Bible contains any contradictions or anomalies like this at all is not an option available to the creedal Christians who hold to God-breathed biblical inerrancy.
God is incapable of an imperfect work. He's incapable of producing an imperfect Bible.
Do you see how this is a problem? When your options are either atheism or a God that commands the hacking up of babies, you can see why people become atheists. Just because Jordan Peterson is excellent at pointing out the problems with a secular worldview does not mean the creedal Christian tradition is the answer. Just notice the problems atheists rightfully point out with these radical creedal notions of God.
So in my mind, I guess by my lights, a perfect being doesn't change. A perfect being, if they're maximally good, maximally moral...
Does our understanding of the perfect being change?
Our understanding might, but presumably what the perfect being is revealing...
Well, I agree. How do we distinguish between that, though, at the human level?
How do we distinguish between whether...
Between our transforming understanding of perfection and perfection itself.
Between our...
We can only see through our own lenses.
Presumably a perfect being would be revealing all of these aspects all the time, especially if God's outside of time. I don't know how a God who's outside of time is revealing different things at different times. That just seems like incoherent to me.
Imagine something that's perfect.
Sure.
And complete.
Sure.
Okay, and it's trying to communicate with creatures who are anything but that.
Sure.
Well, they're going to get it wrong.
And there it is, folks. Jordan just rejected biblical infallibility, and rightfully so. He makes a good point. If humans wrote the Bible, then it's possible that the books in it may contain errors, which run contrary to the overall theme and message of the inspired biblical library. But Alex is quick to point out that's not an option in the creedal Christian world.
Sure.
Okay, now wait a sec. Do you blame that on the interpreters or the phenomena itself?
Wait, but who's getting it wrong here? Peterson responds that our understanding of that perfect being might change throughout time. But what about the people who wrote it down in the first instance? Was their understanding correct or not? Because they recorded this command of God, which was to slaughter innocent children. Were they somehow misinterpreting God? If they were, then the text they wrote down, which is now part of the scriptural canon, is unreliable.
I really don't understand how someone as smart as Alex can hold the notion that the Bible is either 100% infallible or else it is unreliable. Does he say that about any other book? Humans can create reliable works of science and wisdom all the time, and no one has to claim these works are infallible in order for them to be reliable. But let's move on to perhaps the more critical part, and that is the utter confusion in the creedal Christian world about the nature of God. In a really dumb move, Jordan Peterson chose this as one of his claims.
My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Okay, but how can Jordan claim that atheists don't know what God is if Jordan himself is famous for not being able to provide a meaningful definition of God?
So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. The reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero.
Okay, so obviously we have to define what we mean when we use the word God. Like, what is it that that word is pointing to? Now, for a Latter-day Saint, the word God can be used to refer to the Father, the Godhead, to divinity itself, or even to eternal law. But we don't say it refers to all of those things at the same time. However, creedal Christians use the word God to refer to a being, a person, a nature, an essence, and a bunch of other things all at the same time. And all of this leads to God being this sort of undefined abstraction, more akin to what you might hear from Plato or Aristotle.
But God is not a being in the world. God is the creative ground of all that exists. God is the unmoved mover. He's the uncaused cause.
So following the creedal lead, Jordan defines God as some kind of abstraction.
What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions. Now, I believe that, for all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes.
In trying to figure out what the heck Jordan is even talking about when he uses the word God, I think this is about as close as you get. He defines God as the thing of highest value, which he was brilliantly challenged on at Jubilee.
So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy, right? And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you could call it top or bottom, I suppose. Right. At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
is that
right.
Correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's why we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth.
Okay, so right off the bat, a brilliant question. Remember, for Peterson, God is just defined as whatever is at the base of the value hierarchy, the fundamental value. This woman, Zena, has asked, can't people have different fundamental values? Peterson says, yes, of course. But if God is just defined as that fundamental value, that means that there are lots of different gods. Remember, for Peterson, God is not just the justification for that basic value or something. God is the basic value. Insofar as God exists, he is just that fundamental value. So if there are different fundamental values, it seems like there really exist different gods, at least in the sense of exist that Jordan Peterson would apply to God.
And this is a real problem for the creedal Christians. You see, while Latter-day Saints say that God is good, creedal Christians define God as the fundamental value, or as goodness itself. The problem is that goodness, so far as I can tell in a moral sense, is a word that we use to describe the relationship of something to some notion of ultimate suffering and its opposite, what we might call ultimate well-being. Now, I highly recommend that you visit my website and see my morality section in my apologetics course for more on this subject. However, when we say as Latter-day Saints that God is good, we are not saying that he is goodness itself in some Platonic sense, but rather we are saying God is the one who can bring us into the ultimate state of well-being, which is right relationship with him and with other people. And when Peterson or creedal Christians misunderstand this and say that God is some sort of Platonic abstraction, like the fundamental value itself, it creates all sorts of problems which atheists like Alex can tear apart, especially when you consider that people have different fundamental values.
But presumably Jordan Peterson is not a polytheist. He believes in one God if he believes in a God at all. And so how can he account for the fact that there are various fundamental values and yet presumably only one actual God?
So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Well, hold on. It's not better to just think of that as a value, because that fundamental value is God. I thought we made that a matter of definition.
Right, but the bottom is God, and
That's a definition, yeah.
Yeah, so at the bottom is God, and there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
Yeah, if God just is that foundation, then we've now got multiple gods, and we need to know how to account for that. Okay, this is where it's about to get really interesting.
It depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell.
Okay, so there are right and wrong fundamental values. How do we determine what is a right fundamental value and what is a wrong fundamental value?
So you're saying...
So they're not all equal. Like, all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational. Right?
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet better than another one?
That's an excellent question.
I agree. In fact, I think that's the most important question anyone has asked so far.
And I will say it's the fundamental moral question. In other words, what are we talking about when we say that something is good or bad in a moral sense? And as I have mentioned in my apologetics course on morality, we are talking about how something relates to some conception of ultimate suffering. We call things good, including God, if they move us farther away from ultimate suffering. And this is exactly what is guiding Peterson's notions of good and bad. The very notion of what makes something valuable in a moral sense is its ability to help you move away from some conception of ultimate suffering.
Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So repetition.
It's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend.
Do you see what I mean? Having a game you can play over and over with a friend is considered good. Why? Because that leads you farther from suffering and closer toward some conception of ultimate well-being.
And a friend is better than having a game. So that's one.
Okay, so iterability is one thing that we can use to judge whether a fundamental value is a good fundamental value or a bad fundamental value. But hold on, doesn't that mean we need to value iterability? And we need to use that value of iterability to judge what I thought was supposed to be our fundamental value. If the value is fundamental, that means that it's at the bottom or the top of this value hierarchy. So how can there be a more fundamental value, that is iterability, by which we can then judge that fundamental value. Like seriously, think about this for a moment. We're dealing with the problem of multiple different fundamental values.
Could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
A fundamental value is the most basic value that everything else is oriented towards. If it's the most fundamental value, then you can't have other values by which you judge if it's a good or a bad fundamental value.
Exactly. Moving towards some conception of ultimate well-being and away from some conception of ultimate suffering is just what we mean when we say something is morally valuable or morally good. And all of this is consistent with the LDS notion that God is good because he leads us to our ultimate potential toward what will ultimately fulfill us. Because what we all and he fundamentally value and want is joy. Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. This truth has been known for a long time. Happiness, therefore, being found to be something final and self-sufficient, is the end at which all actions aim. You see, Peterson is conflating God with goodness itself. The fundamental thing we all value is joy. Right relationship with God and one another is what brings us joy. But when you conflate God and joy itself, you run into problems.
Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Okay, so Peterson also values breadth of application, but that's also a value. Like these are all values, iterability, breadth of application, that we're using to judge whether another value is good or bad. But if we're using, say, breadth of application and iterability, these values, to judge some other value X, then that value X is not fundamental, because we're using something more fundamental to judge whether it's valid or not. That means that those are our most fundamental values. Does that mean that they are God? Like iterability and breadth of application just are what God is? Well, that's obviously not right. So what's going on here? If Peterson defines God as a fundamental value, the characteristic quality of a fundamental value is that it's fundamental. It's where the buck stops. You can't get there to the fundamental value and say, well, we've got this other set of values which we'll use to judge whether it's good or bad. That means it's not fundamental.
Exactly. And for Latter-day Saints, this is not complicated. By our very nature, the fundamental thing we value is joy. And joy is what emerges from right relationship with God and each other in the celestial order. Look, I love Dr. Peterson. No one has done more to show the problems both philosophically and practically with the secular worldview. But just because someone can offer a solid critique of another worldview does not mean that they are standing firmly on a solid worldview themselves. And I feel like so many people are stuck between two bad options: the bankruptcy and moral chaos of a secular worldview and the incoherent confusion of the creedal tradition. There are many wonderful people right now that, because of people like Peterson, are questioning their secular assumptions and are willing to look seriously at the Bible and Christianity again. But the reality is that the creedal tradition, with people like Wes Huff telling people that they are going to hell for incorrect theology, and Bill Craig telling people that God sometimes commands the hacking up of infants, is only going to lead people back to atheism. But we, as Latter-day Saints, we have something special. We have something unique. We have new answers that people haven't heard before. We have something that truly came from God and can answer so many deep questions. The reality is that any worldview has its challenges and areas that are not fully understood. But the fruits of the restored gospel and the answers it provides to deep theological and philosophical questions are demonstrably better than others that are on offer. And if you want to learn more about this, check out this video, where an atheist defends the rational strength of LDS beliefs.